Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP, and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Ekulona, and this is Nashville. What is the first poem you learned? Think about it for a second. Mine was the classic, Roses Are Red. Poetry can express love and passion, anger and regret, even whimsy and frivolity. It's an art that takes experience, emotion, and imagery and connects to the soul. Major Jackson has been walking the path of the poet for decades. He's been awarded the Pushcart Prize, published 5 books of poems, and edited the best American poetry. And now, he's about to release a book of new and selected poems. Later this hour, we'll talk with Major Jackson about his writing, his work as host of the Slow Down podcast, and his election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. But first, several new laws targeting transgender Tennesseans took effect at the start of this month. Here to talk about them is WPLN's Mariana Bacallao. Hey, Mariana, good to see you again. Welcome back to This is Nashville.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so to start, can you give us an overview? What new laws are on the books?
There are 4 new laws total, and listeners are likely familiar with the big 2, the ban on gender-affirming care for minors and the law that narrowly defines sex to be your sex assigned at birth in the state's constitution. There was already a law on the books that prohibits trans athletes from playing on the sports team that aligns with their gender in public K-12 schools and state colleges. Now, a new bill extends that to include the state's private K-12 schools. And the last law gives legal protections for teachers who don't use a student's preferred pronoun, provided the student is trans or non-binary.
All right, so what about the laws that didn't go into effect?
Well, most notable there is the law restricting drag in public spaces. A federal judge struck that down last month after issuing a temporary injunction. So the courts prevented that law from taking effect. But if it had, it would have been in April, which is a little ahead of when new laws usually take effect. Most have a start date of July 1st.
Okay, so going back to the law you mentioned just now, narrowing the definition of sex in the state constitution, what does that mean for trans folks?
Well, it means they can't change the gender marker on their driver's license or their birth certificates, but it doesn't impact their ability to legally change their names. I spoke with Jordan Stringer of Legal Aid Society. He's running a clinic to help people petition to change their names, and he says the process is not as daunting as people may think.
Our names are really fundamental to how we engage with the world and how we represent ourselves. And under Tennessee law, if you have lived here for 6 months and you are an adult over 18 years of age, there is still a process that you can go through to get that name changed.
So he says it's still an easy and legal process.
All right, and the ban on gender-affirming care for trans youth that didn't go into effect at the start of the month as lawmakers wanted, but is in effect now. Tell me, what happened?
So there's been some legal back and forth on the constitutionality of this law. The ACLU and Lambda Legal sued to block the law on behalf of 3 Tennessee families. The U.S. Department of Justice also filed a similar injunction to temporarily stop the law from taking effect at the start of this month. And they were successful at first. A federal judge sided with the plaintiffs and temporarily blocked the law.
Feels like there's a but coming.
But hours after that ruling, Tennessee's Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti made an emergency appeal to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And last weekend, that 3-judge panel sided with Skrmetti in a 2-1 decision. It's the first time a federal court has allowed a ban on gender-affirming care to take effect. Other states like Florida, Alabama, and Arkansas have passed similar laws. But the federal judges in those states blocked the law and didn't have a higher court reverse that decision.
All right, so what's next for this law and for families of transgender kids?
A lot of families have already been eyeing other states in case this law went through. But getting access to that care might mean a further drive than many families were originally anticipating. Tennessee is now surrounded by states that have passed or proposed bans of their own. And not all families have the ability to go out of state. Lucas Cameron Vaughn is a lawyer with the ACLU of Tennessee. He says that not everyone can afford the travel expenses or the time off of work.
Families that don't have the resources to access the care out of state are going to lose access to the medical care altogether. And that will greatly increase the risk that their children will suffer from some depression, anxiety, or even suicide. The families I've talked to are terrified.
As for the law, the current appeals court ruling allowing Tennessee's ban to take effect is temporary. The court has until the end of September to reach a final decision on whether the law will stay in effect while the lawsuit continues.
That is WPLN's Mariana Bacallao. You can find the link to her story on this episode's web post at WPLN.org. Thanks for your reporting as always, Mariana.
Thanks for having me.
We have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk with acclaimed poet, Vanderbilt professor, and now member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Major Jackson. Do you have a favorite poem by Major Jackson? Let us know by tweeting us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Colonna, and this is Nashville. In 1780, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences was formed to, quote, to cultivate every art and science. In the 243 years since, the Academy has inducted some of the most brilliant writers and thinkers into its ranks. Poet and Vanderbilt English professor Major Jackson is one of the Academy's newest members. Major Jackson is the author of the books The Absurd Man, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Hoops, and Leaving Saturn. He's also been working as podcast host for The Slowdown with American Public Media, all while preparing for the release of his latest book, a collection of new and selected poems. He's a busy man, and we're honored that he's agreed to give us a little bit of his time to talk. I'd like to welcome Major Jackson to This Is Nashville.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being back with us. And congratulations to you, my friend, for your election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Tell me how...
Thank you. Merci beaucoup and gracias.
Oh, yes. De nada, my friend. How does it feel to be in?
Well, it's obviously a deep, deep honor. Slightly overwhelming. I got the news while I was, interestingly enough, recording. And in between recordings, I opened up my email and the announcement was there, or rather the letter was there. And I walked out. I kind of told my producer, I got to take a minute here, catch my breath. It's one of the kind of, if you're in the humanities, it's one of the great honors. And for me, it was one in which I kind of did one of those kind of like quick, if you can think cinematically, just a quick rewind all the way back to those early years of being a writer and all the books, all the poems I read, the literature, the engagement, all culminated to this monumental moment for me. And so I was deep in my feelings, as we say.
Did you think of anyone in particular, a teacher, professor, or a conversation that you've had over the years as you learned about this great achievement?
Man, so many writers that I can point to who have inspired me or taught me, like Sonia Sanchez and at Temple University as an undergrad, and Garrett Hongo as my graduate teacher, mentor at University of Oregon. But a number of the folks who are not writers who are also part of the Academy, like Duke Ellington and Pablo Picasso, you just name it. There's international as well as American, international honorees as well as American. So when you throw all those names in there, artists, politicians, you start to understand the great kind of weight that being a writer and being a poet and the significance of it, how it's also an art form that's treasured as part of giving a portrait of who we are, thinking about our past, thinking about some solutions vis-a-vis language that could move us forward.
You mentioned some of the greats. Duke Ellington, Pablo Picasso, Glenn Close is a member. Founding fathers John Hancock and others are members of this esteemed society of intellectuals and artists. What makes that special for you? Because you have been selected for your work and your poetry.
For me, it suggests that several things. One, there's a poet that we no longer read named Michael Harper, who talks about being in a continuum of consciousness, I should say. And my work has always wanted to engage poetry, but particularly Afro-American poetry, American poetry, and global poetries. And this honor suggests that not only am I in that stream, but I'm also engaged in other areas of our lives in which we are contemplating what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to use language and use language artfully? How can we capture the present moment and divine the moment that we're living in? So for me, it kind of honors all those questions that I've been kind of engaged with. And it feels like a pivot moment. It feels like, in the year in which I'm putting out, literally 5 days before the actual ceremony, my 6th book will be published. So it feels like a very fruitful moment for me to be contemplating what's next.
Your talents and abilities and skills are completely fertile, to use a term. Do you have a sense of what you want to do? To accomplish of what you want to accomplish as a member?
I'm contemplating an epic that forwards the humanities as kind of central to how we understand the world. No offense to science and, of course, the great kind of questions that we're wrestling with right now, artificial intelligence. But we really have to come back to the centrality of human experience, human emotion, and also human safety. I was, just thinking about some of the trans laws that you just covered, and we're not creating a space in which people feel safe. So how can language be accountable to kind of push us towards understanding these very visceral questions that we are dealing with? So I'm joking when I say an epic, but I do think it's a level of maturity when you can start thinking about your work within outside of which a lot of people think of poetry as this kind of egocentric space, but it's a level of maturity when you can kind of negotiate both the small daily aspects of life and maybe translate that as best as you can to larger questions of community, larger questions of identity, nationhood, selfhood, all those things that, people like Walt Whitman and Amiri Baraka and Allen Ginsberg and so many other poets were thinking about how to make poetry relevant in a way that feels authentic to themselves by way of their aesthetics, but also meaningful to a large body of readerships or listeners.
Yeah, that's what I appreciate about poetry, because no matter how much time you spend with it, it gives you the opportunity to be contemplative and to think about life outside of yourself and others. And, I'm looking at what you do. You're a full-time author. You're also the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair of the English Department, but you also host the Slow Down podcast for American Public Media and the Poetry Foundation. And can you really briefly describe to our listeners what they expect should they tune in?
Sure. Well, first of all, shout out to all the producers in APMG Studios who kind of committed over now almost, I want to say 7 years, almost 7 years, to presenting a poem by way in the podcast medium, presenting a poem that is preceded by a moment of thinking about how the poem speaks to some aspect of the host's life. I happen to be the third host, previously preceded by two now former poet laureates, our current Ada Limon, and before that, Tracy K. Smith. And so my producer and I, Micah Kilbon, along with Beth Pearlman, we kind of scour books, magazines, online publications, journals, for poems that we feel as though can reach the widest audience. But maybe more importantly, something that I can kind of be triggered into some past moment, some antidote that I can share, hopefully with humor, hopefully with some wisdom behind it. But it's a quick podcast. It's like 5 to 7 minutes, 7 minutes max. I try to be honest, try to get us down to 3, but those would be haikus. That wouldn't work.
Yeah. So did you ever envision yourself in the radio podcasting profession?
During the pandemic, I started, like many of us, I guess, kind of envisioning and contemplating putting together a podcast. And I own these cassettes. I collect cassettes of poets reading. And some of them are my own recordings from just having read with so many poets over the years. And I want to share like that special moment that happens when you are at a reading and the author is channeling something greater than just that moment, just that self. We're brought together in this almost kind of sacred space of human exchange. Something you mentioned earlier about how you value poetry as something that is reflective. It's reflective, and it also emerges from an individual who has their own unique experience. How often do we give each other that kind of audience, particularly in the medium of a poem? We might say, well, there's other forms of art. Yes, true. But something about the distillation of a poem being so central to the identity and selfhood of a single person. So that was going to be my podcast. It was going to be called, you ready? You ready for it?
Yeah.
Major Voices.
Oh, nice.
You like that?
Yeah, that's a nice little flip right there.
So I didn't envision it, but let me just say, this podcast, The Slowdown, is, and what I would have been doing had I had my, ducks in a row with Major Voices, would have been a continuation of something that I've been doing for a long time. And that is serving as an advocate of the art, serving as someone who looks at language and literature and all the literary arts as a kind of estate, and in a way, me as a caretaker of that estate. So as a teacher, and maybe even as a friend, I'd like to matchmake. I want to put forward poets, more importantly, poems that might be meaningful. So the Slowdown, meaningful to listeners or readers, or maybe an inspiring poet. So the Slowdown is just a continuation of my work as a curator of poetry, as a teacher of poetry, as someone who has showed up at weddings, funerals, and brought something that was fitting for the moment.
Props to you for keeping tape cassettes alive. I'm totally in that mission. Yeah. Got to do it. Got to do it.
Well, I didn't mention, what really helped me out was digitizing them, and I haven't found a quick, fast process of doing that.
No. You got to go through every summer jam that you've ever recorded. I understand that.
Right? Exactly.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekalona. We're talking this hour with Major Jackson about poetry, podcasting, and his election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You have a question for Major? Tweet us at This Is Nashville. Now, Major, a lot of people have approached me about their own podcast idea or starting how they can get one going themselves. And the first thing I tell them is that it's much harder than they think. A lot more than just setting up some microphones and talking. But, you have recited poems to crowds and you've read them aloud. Was there a learning curve for you when you started hosting the Slowdown?
Oh, that is such on point. When you are giving a reading publicly, your body is there. Your body, maybe even before you start speaking, people, there's a poet, hopefully you're not wearing, one of those French berets or something like that. But they know you're a poet. They're waiting for you,
Mm-hmm.
And there's gesticulation that happens, and there is, maybe you might even move your body into it. You can't do that on the radio. No one sees you, So somehow you have to, through your voice, translate some of the nuances of the words of the poems, its meaning, maybe even how it lineates or what it looks like on the form. On the page, the form on the page. The other learning curve for me was I grew up with a grandmother who just was adamant about enunciation.
Mm-hmm.
Every word had to have its proper sounding. So this, pickups.
Yeah.
I can read a poem and you may hear the end result, but I can assure you there was probably at least a dozen takes.
Oh, yeah.
And particularly early on, I think I'm a little bit more seasoned now, but yeah, that was a learning curve. I would also say I am reading closer than I ever have before. And it has to do with me thinking about audience, not so much demographic, but how the poem may sound in the ear and to different audiences. So I understand and have heard from people in Australia who share the Slowdown episodes, podcasts with their children. I have my peeps in Nashville. I have friends who are poets themselves who are listening, and a very devoted listenership who was listening long before I even took up the helm. So everyone is listening for some angle. Sometimes it's, the sound of the poem. Sometimes it's what might emerge as wisdom. Some folks are treasuring how the poem fits within their day, their routine in the morning or after work or in the evening. And somehow I have to be present enough to have the poem speak to wherever they are at that moment. That's a new level of engaging the art that I hadn't previously considered.
As you said, the podcast is 5 to 7 minutes long, and that's enough time to really get in, drop these gems, and get out and have it impact the listener and the audience the way that you just described. Tell me, what have you learned from sitting in the host chair? How has that impacted your relationship with your craft?
Yeah, I have been writing. I'm part of a Monday writing group who's meeting right now as we speak. And the poems for me, I'm thinking about, when I first started writing, I would write these long kind of narrative poem, very attentive to music or a lyric dimension, a kind of melodicness to it. But I'm finding myself going more towards shorter poems that are more impactful, much in the same way that the poems that I read are on the slowdown. So that's not that I haven't done that in the past, but I'm returning to brevity and economy as essential elements of how a poem may reach, and maybe even just drop down some questions, how it lingers. That's exciting to me.
Okay, now you have agreed to read some of your work with us. For which
I have.
We are truly, truly grateful. Will you read? Will you share one with us now?
Sure.
What's the title?
The title is How to Listen. And I'll give some background on this. I grew up in Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, particularly around the time that I was writing this, a number of states had closed down mental hospitals. And so the homeless population were often folks who suffered from some sort of mental illness. And I encountered this one particular person who was wearing a military jacket, one of those green army jackets. And I just imagined him to have been a veteran and used him as a someone that I felt as though, a figure that I felt as though we should listen to hear their stories, their narratives. How to listen. I'm going to cock my head tonight like a dog in front of McGlinchey's Tavern on Locust. I'm going to stand beside the man who works all day combing his thatch of gray hair, corkscrewed in every direction. I'm going to pay attention to our lives unraveling between the forks of his fine-toothed comb. For once, we won't talk about the end of the world or Vietnam or his exquisite paper shoes. For once, I'm going to ignore the dancing and the profanity and the jukebox so I can hear his head crackle beneath the sky stretch of faint stars.
Wow. Tell me more about that piece.
Well, I think the McGlinchey's Tavern, by the way, is this kind of legendary bar in downtown Philadelphia where a number of either academics or intellectually leaning folks would populate in the evening. And, one could encounter at the bar debates on philosophers as much as how horrible the bear was. They went hand in hand.
Okay.
And so I intentionally placed it there because it is one of those spaces where conversation is important, language important, as important as sports too. Don't get me wrong. There were screens there, but to ignore all of that and pay attention to the least wise among us seems like something that we should be doing more frequently. And the last line, so I can hear his head crackle, that's both literal and figurative. Beneath the sky stretch of faint stars, as if, to read this person or engage this person is as important as engaging the cosmos or the large questions of existence beyond us. Somehow, I believe the least wise among us do have the answer. At least they can reflect some aspect of our humanity or a corner of human experience that we do not and will not experience ourselves. So this is the last poem, I should say, in my first book. And in a way, it sets an agenda for the rest of my books. I always want to be attentive to human experiences that are on the margins or outside of mainstream conversations.
It's like to me, it reflects on slowing down you know,
Ooh,
and
look at you.
learning from somebody. Like the man you described in this poem reminds me of some of the people I would talk to and listen to when I was working as a bar manager in Albuquerque, New Mexico. People who were unhoused, they used to come around for food or water, and you know, I would take time and talk to them because there I did gain a lot of insight and a lot of wisdom, not only on their lives, but humanity and the human experience. And right now our society is so fast paced. We don't really, we don't see the people in front of us, and we missed opportunities not only for connection, but for true understanding. Let me ask you this, to you, what is the place of poetry in this fast paced world we're living in?
Well, you answered half of it right there. I think in a way the level of attention that a poem demands, it's not like, you know, a kind of 20-minute quick streaming episode of the latest show that's hot right now. It really does have us kind of pay attention to language, pay attention to syntax, how sentences are built together, pay attention to music, the what a friend of mine calls kind of the inner music of language. But I want to go back to, as I like often to say, when you read a poem, it makes you aware of how language is used outside in our everyday lives. And so when we encounter language, often it's to sell us something. Often it is to influence us. Language is highly, highly persuasive. Most poems do not carry that kind of intense agenda setting. Most don't. There are some that do, that get into areas of proselytizing one particular perspective. But lately I've been saying, you know, if you hear a news report that doesn't sound right, if you encounter a mayoral speech that doesn't sound right, go to a poem. You know, go to a book of poems. It's almost like rinsing your mind in a way. So I do think the role of poetry is always to keep us ever aware of how language operates in our world and in society. And not to say that those other uses of language are not legitimate, but often we need to kind of like be aware where cliches that arise that may dehumanize individuals or make us fear each other or make us not feel good about ourselves. I mean, you know, these are methods, right? So poetry, the function of poetry is all of that, but also to make us ever attentive.
Well, let's stay attentive after this quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Major Jackson and learn about his path to becoming a poet, a path that took him through Nashville as a youth. What does poetry mean to you? Let us know by tweeting us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Khalil Ekulona, and this is Nashville. We're talking this hour with acclaimed poet, essayist, professor, and podcaster Major Jackson, who was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences earlier this year. Before the break, we discussed the essence of poetry and its place in our fast-paced world. Now let's learn about how he fell in love with poetry and found his voice as a writer. Major Jackson, thanks again for being with us today.
My pleasure.
So,
thank you.
Have you always wanted to be a poet and writer?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to kind of two rivers running side by side. One of them was in my house. My grandparents had a book collection, and there were two important books in there, the only books of poetry. One was the selected poems of Langston Hughes, and the other was this paperback edition of Robert Frost poems. And I took to those books because when I had to, when I was told to read a book, turn off the TV, books of poems were right there, and they were short. You know, I could digest a poem in 15 minutes or less. And when my grandmother or grandfather asked if you read, I said, yeah, I read a poem. And they couldn't argue with that. You know, it wasn't War and Peace.
Yeah.
But the other was, you know, like a lot of kids in my youth, my generation was part of that second wave of young men and women inspired by hip hop. And many of us either wanted to be a DJ or wanted to be an MC. I was of the latter and had my book of rhymes, which I didn't share often. And eventually, though, that is what sensitized me to language and brought me to the idea that poetry could be made up of language that we used every day. And not only that, it can reflect the lives that we lived, at least in my neighborhood, in the streets of North Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And so there was this, early on, this populist notion of language operating in an artful way for the purpose of reflecting experiences of my life and those around me.
Okay, now you mentioned that these books, Robert Frost, Langston Hughes, from your grandparents' house, but also the influence of hip hop. Got to ask you a few questions about that. Did you have an MC name?
Oh man,
What'd you call yourself?
This is embarrassing. I was MC Dink. That rhymes with think. I was trying to play off of think.
Nice.
But you know, and there's a lot that can rhyme with think. Sink. Mm-hmm. You know, think. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, and keep going on.
It's mink. Cold. Get yourself a mink. Yeah, exactly. We're going there. Look, I called myself Details when I first started. So we all
MC Details.
Yeah, because I spent too much time in the details, in the weeds. It was too many words. But you know, okay. So on the form of hip hop, who were your influences? Like, what was it about their words that made you want to pick up the pen?
Wow. Rakim, for example. Mm-hmm. Just, you know, taking the art itself and making a metaphor of it. All the metaphor making, and the cadence and the flow. And so what people probably don't realize now is that we've gone through multiple kind of idioms and shifts in how people flowed. Mm-hmm. And the flow was your essence. Like, it was your spirit. It was like how you walked, how you like engaged, even almost as important as what you wore, you know. And you can go to the 80s and see what we wore, of course. You can Google 80s hip hop and see what we wore. But just that sense of style, like that early on impressed upon me a necessity to kind of be authentic with language on the page, or if I was back then rapping, or later in life if I was reading before an audience. That, I don't know, you know, if you're a serious artist, and you know, by the way, we got to also say that artists are they're as much listeners if they're musicians. If they are visual artists, they look at other visual artists and they know the history of their material. If you're a writer or a poet, like you go deep and inside language and inside the art to learn how to manipulate language and how to stretch out words, all of that. So for me, that was early on. I understood that I had to be a reader. You know, I had to be someone who not just wrote from this very egocentric space, but also someone who was going to carry the history of the art form and awareness and knowledge. And I got that from early on from listening to the rappers. You know, they high-fived each other. You know, they riffed off of each other.
And
most.
And
I'm sorry.
And now we're seeing like the effects of people being able to understand the importance and the value and the relationship between hip hop, these MCs, these writers, and poetry. I mean, in the recent years, artists like Tupac and Nas, people are looking at their lyrics the same way we look at Bob Dylan's lyrics.
Yes, that's right. Because I think, not only is it a window into the moments in which they were writing, but it also allows us to see some of the innovation such that we can build on that, innovation. And that's a really important part of being any kind of like professional artist or even a, athlete. You study what's been done in the past. Some of the jazz artists that I listen to, or even hip hop artists, there's not too many today that I listen to, but I can hear that they're carrying forward previous approaches. It's pretty phenomenal to engage the art from inside like that.
Yeah, to be inside and to have a history. I mean, hip hop turns 50 this year. Real quick, where do you want to see it grow?
Oh man, I feel as though hip hop grows when we become curious about each other and not just representing where we're from. And so it would be interesting to see how the lyrics do more than, as Jay-Z once said, be more than just a person bragging on the song, But it starts to reflect the issues that many of us face, that challenges our dignity. I would like for the art to return to those roots.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekalona. We're talking this hour with the poet Major Jackson about his craft and how he found his voice. You can tweet us your comments at This Is Nashville. Now, you've been here in Nashville working at Vanderbilt teaching English, but I understand that you have deeper connections to the city going back to your childhood. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, geez, from age 2 to age 12, my grandparents, who were originally from Nashville, brought me and my cousins down here for, it felt like right up until school started up north, which was early September. And most of my family lived in North Nashville. I have very faint, it's almost like black and white memories of playing in Hadley Park. And what seems, I was talking to a cousin recently. I was like, did we actually roll down the hill of the Capitol? Like, I can't even imagine that now. Like my body feels like broke just thinking about, rolling down that hill. But I have a lot of memories. They haven't emerged yet in my work, but what has happened since my arrival is an instigation to explore the history of my family here, particularly my grandfather's side, who I'm named after, Major Gooch. I'm Major Jackson, of course. And I got a haircut, my first haircut over there near Fisk. The barber, her last name was Gooch, and I just, couldn't help but start asking, and we didn't find an immediate link, but I'm really curious about ancestry here and some of what I've already discovered that I'm looking forward to including in my poems.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean to not only be in this place where your ancestry is, to rediscover it as an adult, but also, here, part of the line in the work that you do is such a deep literary tradition here in Nashville.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, as we know, the history here in Nashville is so important to the history of the country. And that makes me very, very proud. And I also believe in epigenetics. I believe that we carry memories in our bodies. And to some extent, I walk these streets and, as I've said elsewhere, can feel the presence or at least think about my grandparents' childhood here and their grandparents who, by the way, I should say, people often think major is a rank, particularly when they first meet me, and I have to say, no, it's my name, and it goes back to pre-Civil War. And, my grandfather's father was born in slavery somewhere around Murfreesboro. That, what it means for me to be back is to kind of tap into that as a source of power and meaning and purpose for my art.
Mm-hmm. Now, we only have a few minutes left, and I do want you to read one more piece with us, but I want to talk about your book that's coming out pretty soon in a few months. It's called Razzle Dazzle. What's the meaning behind that title?
Razzle Dazzle. Let's see. Again, I set these agendas for myself in a way, and maybe they're achievable or not. But, I believe, a poem should be as good as any symphonic score, should be as good and capture our attention as any Picasso canvas. I want language to kind of perform at that level, at that height. I want it to be awe-inspiring. And Razzle Dazzle also speaks to some of my aesthetic, which is I firmly believe in metaphoric language. I love how through either similes or metaphors or allegorical speech, we can, in a way, talk in code to each other. And those various levels, holding those various levels of meaning, I think is really important to our growth as individuals. Mm-hmm. So Razzle Dazzle, at least in the title, it's both aesthetic, it's aspirational. It is what we call an ars poetica. It is how I approach the poem.
Okay, well, here we go with Major Jackson reading his poem, Let Me Begin Again.
I'm going to read the poem, but I want to dedicate it to Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, who's my colleague at Vanderbilt University, who's also elected into the American Academy of Arts and Science. Wonderful artist, I should say. Fantastic artist. Let me begin again. Let me begin again as a quiet thought in the shape of a shell, slowly examined by a brown child on a beach at dawn, straining to see their future. Let me begin this time knowing the drumming in my dreams is me inheriting the earth, is morning lighting up the rivers. Let me burn my vanities, old music in the pines, snifters of scotch, a day moon like a signature of night. This time, let me circle the island of my fears only once, then live like a raging waterfall and grow a magnificent mustache. Let me not ever be the bird cage or the serrated blade or the empty season. Dear glacier, dear sea of stars, dear leopards disintegrating at the outer limits of our greed. Soon we will encounter you only in motivational tweets. Reader, I should have married you sooner. This time, let me not sleep like the prophet who believes he's seen infinity. Let me run at breakneck speeds toward sceneries of doubt. I have no more dress rehearsals to attend. Look closer. I am licking my lips.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That feels like a declarative statement of purpose and dedication. Real quick, we have just under a minute left. What do you want listeners to get from that?
I want listeners to embody the idea that we all can begin again and pay more attention to each other and be accountable to our language and be accountable to each other. And also to think about beginnings as a way forward rather than what we are stressed today, to value a past, a forgotten past of greatness. Well, in fact, we're here and we're great today.
Major Jackson is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of English at Vanderbilt University, the author of 5 books of poetry, and an acclaimed essayist, podcast host, and the new inductee to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Major, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your beautiful work with us. And thank you for talking with me, my friend.
Thank you, Khalil. It's been a great, great honor, truly.
And thanks to you for tuning in this hour. This is Nashville is a production of WPLN News and Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced by our senior producer, Steve Harush. Michaela Elias is our technical director. Our executive producer is Andrea Tuthope. The masterminds behind our theme music are Larange and Namir Blade. You can listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get your podcasts. The conversation doesn't end here. Tweet us at This Is Nashville. Find us on Instagram and tell us what you want from our show by filling out our quick survey online. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil Ekolona. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody, and be good to each other.